They weren't supposed to miss it. In 1989, deep in a secure KGB analysis facility outside Moscow, 4 Soviet aerospace engineers stared at a classified photograph laid across a steel table. It had been taken from a modified Zenith satellite passing over the Nevada desert. The image was blurry heat, distorted, lacking contrast, but the outline was unmistakable. A black, diamond-shaped object casting no shadow, surrounded by what looked like heat haze. The flight path, altitude, and timing had all been calculated perfectly. But the problem wasn't the photo. The problem was the radar. Because according to Soviet early warning logs, nothing flew that night. No blip, no trace, no radar spike. The radar operators swore the sky was clear, but here it was, a real aircraft, and it had flown straight through the most powerful radar nets ever built and emerged invisible. For the men in that room, trained to believe that radar was omniscient, this was not just confusing. It was terrifying. A plane that exists outside detection wasn't just a threat. It was a collapse of the most fundamental assumption in Soviet defense doctrine, that to see is to control. And it wasn't just one aircraft. Intercepts of whispered intel from East German informants suggested this ghost was part of a larger fleet. Lockheed, Northrop, possibly McDonnell Douglas. The Americans were building weapons that couldn't be seen, tracked, or targeted. Stealth wasn't science fiction anymore. It was operational, real, untouchable. The KGB's most elite aerospace section, Department 8 of Directorate T, activated an emergency task force. Their mission to determine how the Americans had broken the laws of detection. Because if they didn't understand it, if they couldn't steal it, then they couldn't defend against it. And for the first time in years, Soviet intelligence faced a problem they couldn't locate. No radar, no heat trail, no theory, just a black triangle over Nevada, and a realization spreading like dread through the intelligence community. If you can't detect the weapon, you won't know the war has started. For over 30 years, the Soviet Union's strategic foundation rested on a belief as fundamental as gravity radar sees all. From Moscow's defense ministry to the easternmost radar outpost near Vladivostok, this principle shaped everything. Radar was not just a tool, it was truth. If a threat approached, it would be detected. If it was detected, it could be destroyed. Soviet doctrine built entire war plans around that assumption. Their SAM systems, SA-2, SA-5, SA-10, were designed to fire in waves, tracking targets electronically, overwhelming maneuver with volume. Air defense corridors blanketed Warsaw Pact territories. Interceptor aircraft like the MiG-25 and MiG-31 relied on ground-based radar uplinks to direct engagements. The entire Red Air Force functioned as an extension of a massive, radar-centered nervous system. And so when the CIA began testing something in the Nevada desert, an aircraft with no contrails, no visible heat bloom, no radar echo, Soviet analysts assumed the worst, then dismissed it. Because to accept it would mean accepting that radar wasn't truth. That invisibility could be real. At the highest levels of the GRU and KGB's technical divisions, analysts debated the possibility of low observable airframes. Some theorized about radar-absorbent materials. Others speculated about passive flight profiles or edge-aligned geometry. But none believed that the Americans would gamble billions on something so fragile, so experimental. Stealth is fiction. One KGB aerospace file read in 1982. Another assessment described radar denial as a Western overinvestment in improbable science. They believed that speed was king, that if America was building anything, it would be hypersonic, that Lockheed and Northrop were wasting budget, that the U.S. couldn't keep a secret this big. And above all, they believed they'd steal it first. The Soviet spy machine had infiltrated American aerospace for decades. From the B-29 to the F-4 Phantom, designs had been photographed, smuggled, even reverse-engineered. By the 1970s, Moscow had full schematics of the SR-71 Blackbird, so when whispers of a new black project emerged, they were confident, arrogant. They assumed they'd see it coming, but stealth wasn't coming. It had already arrived, and by the time the KGB realized they had no mole, no specks, no radar contact, just blurry satellite images of an angular black shape, they understood the most dangerous assumption they'd made, that what can't be seen doesn't exist. In the war rooms of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, doctrine was built not on imagination, but on engineering certainty. The principles were clean, mathematical, unshakable. If it flies, it reflects. If it reflects, radar sees it. If radar sees it, SAMs kill it. Every surface-to-air missile in the Soviet arsenal, from the long-range SA-5 to the short-range SA-13, was designed on that chain of logic. Every radar array, from P-14 Tall King early warning sets to the dense fire control radars embedded in Warsaw Pact nations, operated under the belief that no object could fly across the sky without lighting up on a screen. The Soviets had spent billions perfecting that idea, and it worked against American aircraft that had speed, agility, and firepower. From Vietnam to Egypt, Soviet-built SAMs had bloodied American air power. MiGs, guided by ground radar, downed F-105s and Phantoms. Air defense units proudly logged hundreds of kills. So when whispers emerged of a new American program, not faster, not better armed, not more maneuverable, but invisible, Soviet command dismissed it outright, because doctrine said that such a thing couldn't exist. To deny radar visibility, an aircraft would need absurdly sharp angles that ruined aerodynamics, materials that absorbed instead of reflected electromagnetic energy, heat suppression systems that defied modern turbine physics, and control systems so precise they bordered on theoretical. No sane Air Force, they believed, would build something that couldn't dogfight, couldn't outrun missiles, and couldn't carry large payloads, all in exchange for being harder to see. But that was the doctrine talking, and American engineers had stopped listening to that doctrine decades ago. While Soviet designers kept refining the MiG line, while radar ranges grew longer and missile speeds faster, the U.S. began to disappear. Literally, the Have Blue program in 1977, Lockheed's Skunk Works, the use of supercomputers to model radar wave interaction on non-reflective shapes, the invention of radar-absorbent paint so secret it was never written down, black jets flying at night over deserts, their heat signatures flattened, their radar echoes warped into nothing. None of that fit the Soviet handbook. And so when Soviet early warning radars failed to track unidentified objects over East Germany in the late 80s, blaming signal loss, cloud interference, or transient anomalies, they didn't realize the truth. It wasn't a glitch. It was a new doctrine, flying circles around theirs, because stealth wasn't the next generation of air combat. It was the cancellation of their entire strategy. And once it went operational, the Soviet Union would be left swinging blind-armed, angry, and completely unable to see the kill shot coming. It happened over East Germany in early 1983, an event so quiet, so fleeting, that Soviet radar operators didn't even realize they'd failed until weeks later. At exactly 00:17 local time, a PVO early warning station near Dresden registered a minor fluctuation, an anomalous atmospheric spike that lasted less than 5 seconds. Standard protocol flagged it, logged it, and moved on. No aircraft ID, no radar return, just a brief shimmer in the electromagnetic background. The anomaly passed directly through one of the highest density radar corridors in Eastern Europe. Nothing was scrambled, no alerts raised, because as far as the system was concerned, nothing had entered. But something had, 6 weeks later. A West German double agent delivered a coded packet to a KGB handler in Prague. Inside were low-resolution reconnaissance images, time-stamped, geotagged, and marked with NATO handling codes. The target, a Soviet military research site near Karl-Marx-Stadt. The attacker unknown, the altitude unknown, the aircraft silhouette unidentifiable, but the implications devastating. Soviet analysts were stunned. The incursion had occurred on a moonless night. No contrails, no radar signature, no sonic boom, no missile interception. And the recon photos revealed something else. The object had loitered over the facility for nearly 8 minutes, capturing dozens of high-resolution frames before vanishing. They checked every air defense log. Nothing. They examined all regional radar. Nothing. They pulled MiG-25 flight records. Nothing. What kind of aircraft could enter Warsaw Pact airspace, fly directly over a classified research compound, and escape detection across 4 separate radar networks? The answer came not from Soviet sources, but from whispers in Western aviation circles. Something called the F-117 Nighthawk. Soviet scientists refused to believe it at first. Their models showed the aircraft's shape, jagged, angular, unstable. It shouldn't even be able to stay in the air. And yet, the Americans had built it, had flown it, had sent it deep into Soviet reach, and brought it home untouched. The first impossible event had occurred. An aircraft had entered, observed, and escaped from a theater of Soviet power without ever appearing on a screen. The GRU launched an internal review. Was its signal spoofing radar blackout a deliberate deception? No. The simulations were rerun. The data confirmed it. Something had passed through Soviet radar coverage as if it didn't exist. And for the first time, High Command faced the most terrifying question of the Cold War. What else had they missed? Because if one plane could do it once, it meant it could be done again. Anytime. Anywhere. Without warning. When the first confirmed stealth penetration was presented to the Defense Council in Moscow, the mood was not alarm. It was derision. Marshal Sergei Akrameyev, chief of the General Staff, skimmed the GRU's briefing with visible contempt. What they're calling stealth, he said, is just American arrogance in a different shape. The council chuckled. The idea that the Americans had invented an aircraft that defied radar was seen as fantasy Western propaganda wrapped in black paint. The KGB had heard rumors about a black jet since the late 70s, but without blueprints, defectors, or radar confirmation. Soviet leadership treated it as an intelligence ghost, a psychological operation meant to drain Soviet budgets and stir paranoia. Even after the East Germany penetration, many claimed the incursion was either falsified by NATO or the result of sabotage within the Warsaw Pact radar command. Others clung to the notion that the F-117 was nothing more than a UAV or a test platform incapable of combat deployment. But in 1988, something changed. A blurry image of a black, angular aircraft taken from a civilian airfield outside Nellis Air Force Base appeared in Jane's Defense Weekly. The photo matched sketches previously dismissed by Soviet analysts. Then came radio intercepts from the Gulf of Sidra, followed by ELINT anomalies recorded over Saudi Arabia. Still, Moscow wavered. It was easier to mock what couldn't be measured than to accept a doctrine-crushing truth. But the real shock came in January 1991, Operation Desert Storm. Within hours of the war's opening salvos, Iraqi radar systems, many of them Soviet-made, went blind. F-117 Nighthawks flew through the densest anti-aircraft network in the world. Dozens of SA-2s, SA-3s, and SA-6s. Dozens of Zayas U-23-4 Shilka guns, hundreds of radar-guided DUAEA positions, and not a single stealth aircraft was hit. Soviet advisors stationed with Iraqi units filed classified field reports. They described missile launchers firing at nothing, radar operators tracking echoes that vanished mid-sweep, SAM crews staring into blank skies while explosions rocked command bunkers. It was the confirmation Moscow had tried for a decade to deny. Not only did stealth exist, it was combat operational. And worse, they had no defense against it. Suddenly, those jokes at the Defense Council fell silent. The generals stopped mocking American waste. Intelligence files were reopened, reanalyzed. Soviet designers who had once ridiculed faceted geometry now demanded crash studies of radar reflection angles. But it was too late. By the time Moscow believed it, the war was already over, and the weapon that won it had never appeared on a single radar screen. The first theory that Moscow clung to long after the battlefield had disproven it was a comforting one. Stealth only works with overwhelming support. According to Soviet analysts, the F-117's success wasn't due to its design. It was because it had the full weight of American electronic warfare, satellite coordination, and AWACS support behind it. In this view, the aircraft wasn't invisible. It was simply protected by a vast, fragile network. This narrative spread quickly through the Soviet military press and internal briefings. They claimed the F-117 flew under cover of intense jamming from EC-130s. Its success required real-time target data from satellites. It could never survive a high-threat environment without total air dominance. In other words, stealth was just another form of American overreach, a castle of electronics that would collapse the moment it lost one support beam. It was a useful myth, because if true, it meant Soviet air defense hadn't failed. It had simply been overwhelmed by a unique, unrepeatable American operation. But by mid-1991, that theory began to crack. First came the discovery that many F-117 missions during Desert Storm were flown without jamming support. Mission debriefs revealed aircraft entering hostile airspace alone, relying not on ECM protection, but on radar invisibility. Then came the ELINT data across dozens of sorties. Soviet-built Iraqi radar systems never recorded a valid track, not a jammed signal, not a distorted echo, just nothing. Even worse, F-117 pilots weren't maneuvering to evade detection. They flew directly over radar installations, launched laser-guided bombs into hardened bunkers, and exfiltrated calmly while the entire Soviet-designed defense system watched blind. The data destroyed the theory. This wasn't about jamming. It wasn't about support networks. It was about the aircraft itself, its shape, its materials, its design, every radar-absorbent panel, every millimeter of faceted edge, every flight path calculated to exploit radar dead zones. The Soviets had assumed that radar supremacy made aircraft irrelevant. The Americans had built an aircraft that made radar irrelevant. And now, the myth that had shielded Soviet pride was in ruins. They hadn't been out-jammed. They had been out-engineered. When Soviet analysts could no longer blame electronic warfare for the F-117's success, they pivoted to a new theory, one just as flawed, but far more dangerous to believe. The F-117 is only good for soft targets. This narrative offered a lifeline to wounded doctrine. It suggested that stealth aircraft, while invisible, were fragile good for bombing empty runways, radar sites, or poorly defended logistics depots. Not for real combat, not for battlefield penetration, not for hard kills. Soviet Defense Ministry embraced this idea publicly. Internal briefings downplayed the Nighthawk's payload, just two 2,000-pound bombs. No gun, no air-to-air missiles, no ability to engage multiple targets. A surgical scalpel. They called it not a weapon of war, but a tool of intimidation. But that theory fell apart on day one of Desert Storm. F-117s didn't hit empty buildings or fake targets. They took out hardened bunkers, underground command centers, integrated radar nodes, airfield control towers, HQ compounds, Scud launch facilities, all struck with pinpoint accuracy, often from single aircraft, flying alone. On the night of January 16, 1991, the very first wave of the war was led not by bombers, not by cruise missiles, but by 10 F-117s, flying straight into the heart of Baghdad. They hit 26 separate targets, all high priority, all hardened, all guarded by Soviet SAM systems. Not one aircraft was shot down, not one mission aborted, and the damage devastating. Entire command grids collapsed before sunrise. Radar coordination vanished. Iraqi air defenses went blind in the first 24 hours, not because of volume, but because of precision. Soviet advisors embedded in Baghdad radioed back in disbelief. We did not see them. We did not track them. And then, the bunkers exploded. This was not soft targeting. This was surgical decapitation of an entire national air defense grid. The F-117 didn't just survive contested airspace. It operated exclusively in it. It hunted hard targets at night, in the most defended zones on Earth, and returned untouched. The myth of fragile stealth was obliterated. Even more damning, the CIA uncovered Iraqi documents translated from Russian advising commanders to reposition assets away from priority targets at night, because the Americans attack what matters, not what's visible. Soviet doctrine had been based on overwhelming area denial, but the Americans weren't fighting the area. They were targeting the nerve centers, and doing it with machines that Soviet radar couldn't see, and Soviet missiles couldn't touch. By the time the Gulf War ended, the F-117 had flown over 1-200 sorties, hit hundreds of targets, survived every single one. And Moscow's last comfort theory, that the Americans had built a precision scalpel too delicate for real war, it lay in ruins. Under the rubble of bunkers the Nighthawk had left smoking. For decades, the Soviet Union had trusted one pillar above all else in its global rivalry with the United States: steal what they build and copy what works. From the atomic bomb to space shuttles, from B-29 bombers to microchips. Soviet intelligence had proven again and again that espionage could bridge any technological gap. The GRU and KGB's technical directorates prided themselves on penetrating even the most secure American projects. Until stealth. In the 1970s, the CIA and U.S. Air Force did something the Soviets hadn't anticipated. They created an aircraft program so secret, it didn't officially exist. Not even to Congress. Funding was buried in black budgets. Facilities were hidden in the Nevada desert. And the design team, Lockheed's Skunk Works, operated under full compartmentalization, with no external contractors and no written schematics. The GRU tried to penetrate the program through traditional methods. Bribing engineers, tapping communications, infiltrating contractors, recruiting spies at defense expos. It all failed. Why? Because stealth wasn't just about planes. It was about secrecy as a weapon system. The F-117 and its predecessor, the Have-Blue demonstrator, were developed without fanfare, without leaks, and with deliberate misdirection. Engineers were told only what they needed to know. Flight tests occurred at night. Test pilots used code names. The aircraft itself was stored in a hangar, with no markings, in a facility that didn't exist on maps. CIA and Air Force security worked in tandem. Every breach attempt was met with a ghost. Every technical lead the Soviets chased turned cold. Not one technical drawing of the F-117 was ever recovered. Not one accurate photograph. Not one defector with useful specs. By 1986, KGB internal memos admitted failure. We have no visibility on the stealth program. Penetration unsuccessful. For the first time in the Cold War, the Soviet Union wasn't behind. They were completely blind. And as stealth aircraft began appearing in combat, first quietly, then openly, the KGB scrambled to understand what had gone wrong. How had the world's most aggressive intelligence machine been beaten by a single aircraft design? The truth hurt more than any failed mission. Because what the CIA and Skunk Works had created was not just a plane. It was a new model of secrecy. A black program so insulated, so decentralized, that it created a vacuum of data no spy could breach. By the time Soviet engineers finally got their hands on a full F-117 profile after the Cold War, through leaked Western media and declassified reports, it was already too late. The war had moved on, and the Soviets hadn't just missed a design, they'd missed an entire generation of warfare. The F-117 Nighthawk wasn't simply a stealth aircraft. It was the visible tip of an invisible spear, a system so deeply integrated, so meticulously shielded, and so radically asymmetric that Soviet doctrine didn't just fail to match it, it failed to even see it coming. At the heart of it was a philosophy alien to Soviet planners' control through absence. Where the USSR invested in mass and saturation, hundreds of interceptors, thousands of SAMs, and sweeping radar grids, the Americans built something smaller, faster, quieter. They didn't try to dominate the sky by filling it with planes. They dominated it by entering unseen Skunk Works, led by Ben Rich and inheriting the black magic of Kelly Johnson, created a system where secrecy wasn't a layer, it was the foundation. Engineers weren't compartmentalized just to keep secrets. They were compartmentalized to allow radical, unsupervised innovation. No bureaucracy, no excess oversight, just results. But stealth didn't exist in a vacuum. The F-117 was connected to a kill chain of American design, and every link was engineered for survivability, and precision satellite recon identified hardened targets. AWACS and JSTARS coordinated airspace silently. Secure data links fed targeting data in real time. Laser-guided munitions destroyed targets within meters, and the aircraft itself vanished before retaliation. While Soviet strike packages relied on waves of aircraft and brute force suppression, the U.S. could destroy a bunker with a single aircraft, a single bomb, and no warning. And it wasn't just the aircraft, it was the strategy. Soviet systems were reactive. Detect, track, fire. American stealth inverted the model: penetrate, destroy, disappear, no lock-on, no countermeasure. The Soviets had spent decades optimizing radar frequency bands, perfecting multi-layered air defense, and developing interceptor protocols. None of it mattered, because radar is only useful when there's something to see. And the Americans had built ghosts. Even more painful for Soviet generals was the realization that this wasn't a one-off miracle. It was repeatable, scalable. The U.S. was already developing the B-2 Spirit, another black triangle, with global range, nuclear capability, and an RCS smaller than a bird. It was clear the F-117 wasn't a breakthrough. It was Phase 1. The USSR had doctrine. The U.S. had a system, one that didn't rely on numerical superiority, or geographical mass, or even visible presence. It relied on knowing more, sooner, and striking first, without ever being seen. And that system didn't just bypass Soviet radar. It bypassed Soviet thinking. It wasn't fought in the skies over Moscow. It wasn't recorded on radar. It left no wreckage, no dogfight footage. But make no mistake, the F-117 humiliated the Soviet system, publicly and definitively, over Iraq in 1991. Baghdad was supposed to be impregnable, a capital armored with Soviet-made surface-to-air missiles, AA belts, radar domes, and overlapping kill zones. Dozens of Soviet-trained officers operated the equipment. Dozens more had designed the strategy. It was a fortress built from decades of Cold War paranoia and technical pride. And in the early hours of January 17, 1991, it fell apart in complete silence. The F-117s came first, flying alone, unescorted, no jamming, no radar signature. They passed through Iraq's airspace like phantoms, while every Soviet-designed system fired into the dark. SA-2s launched blindly. ZSU-23-4 stitched the sky with metal, and nothing hit. Inside Iraqi bunkers. The first sign of attack wasn't radar contact. It was the detonation of precision bombs. Command centers disappeared. Power grids shut down. Runways cracked. Comms severed. The F-117s returned to base untouched. And then they did it again. Night after night. Sortie after sortie. Over 1,200 missions were flown by 42 F-117s. Hit rate nearly 80%. Losses zero. Soviet observers embedded in Baghdad radioed back in disbelief. Our systems never saw them. Our missiles chased ghosts. One Iraqi commander described it with resignation. We waited for planes. What came was nothing. Then fire. It wasn't just military defeat. It was doctrinal obliteration. Decades of Soviet investment radars, interceptors, missile theory, command doctrine, all of it rendered obsolete in a single campaign by aircraft that didn't exist on their screens. And the worst blow, the Soviets had armed this battlefield. Every SAM that failed, every radar that went blind, every gun that fired wildly into the dark, it was their equipment, their export models, their system, destroyed not by brute force, but by something that defied the very premise of Soviet engineering, that anything in the sky could be seen. The humiliation wasn't just tactical. It was psychological. Because after Baghdad, every nation that had bought Soviet air defense systems began to ask the same question. What good is a shield if it can't see the sword? And every answer pointed back to the F-117, an aircraft the Soviets had spent years denying, mocking, and failing to understand, until it flew through the most defended city on Earth and proved it was real by being invisible. By mid-1991, the reality had set in. The USSR hadn't just lost control of the air. It had lost control of the narrative. For decades. Soviet leadership promised their people and allies that Soviet science would never fall behind, that their radars would protect, that their missile systems were impenetrable, that if war came, it would be fought fairly technology against technology, man against man. But stealth changed the rules. The F-117 didn't fight Soviet defenses. It ignored them. This wasn't a setback, it was a strategic collapse. The sudden realization that the entire Soviet model of warfare, built on visibility, speed, and numerical dominance, had been bypassed by a technology they could neither see nor counter. And worse, the Americans had more. The B-2 was already in testing. The F-22 was entering development. Even their drones, crude by modern standards, were evolving into stealth platforms. Meanwhile, Soviet aerospace engineers still hadn't reverse-engineered a single radar-absorbent composite from the Nighthawk. Soviet generals knew what it meant every dollar invested in SAM systems, every doctrine based on radar coverage, Every strategy dependent on seeing first and shooting first had just been made irrelevant. The Kremlin commissioned emergency studies, new radar frequencies, passive detection networks, IR search and track systems, but none offered a full solution. The problem wasn't radar, it was belief. The belief that what had worked for decades would keep working. The belief that the Americans were playing the same game. The belief that mass could outpace innovation. And so, the psychological wound opened. If Soviet-built defenses failed in Iraq, what would happen in the Warsaw Pact nations? What if NATO sent stealth aircraft over East Germany? Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, Soviet military planners couldn't guarantee detection, couldn't promise retaliation, couldn't even locate the threat. For the first time since 1949, the USSR faced the possibility that its own cities, its command bunkers, its nuclear infrastructure could be targeted and never see it coming. It was more than a weapon system failure. It was the death of parity. And when a system loses its confidence, it fractures. Stealth didn't just give the U.S. air dominance. It broke the illusion that the Cold War was a fair fight. And once that illusion shattered, collapse was inevitable. Today, the F-117 is no longer in frontline service. Its angular body rests in desert boneyards, its black skin dulled by decades of secrecy and sun. But its legacy is not in museums or maintenance hangars. Its legacy lives in fear. Not the fear of attack, but the fear of not knowing when it begins. For the Soviet Union, the F-117 was the plane that shouldn't have existed. Its very shape defied logic. Its invisibility challenged physics. Its victories defied every law of radar warfare the USSR had ever written. And it appeared without warning, struck without challenge, vanished without trace. To this day, Russian aerospace engineers still study it, not because it's the pinnacle of design, but because it changed the definition of air power, because it proved that warfare is not about brute force, but brute knowledge. In 1993, a declassified memo from a former Soviet radar commander put it simply, we built walls of metal and sky. They walked through like ghosts. The Cold War ended, not just in Berlin or in missile silos. It ended in radar rooms, where screens showed nothing, while the war moved silently above them. That is the ghost of the Cold War. Not just a stealth jet, but a warplane that told the Soviet Union, we see you. You don't see us. And for the first time since 1945, the superpower built on visibility went blind.